How did Putin's grand vision of a swift, glorious victory turn into a nightmare of staggering losses? Like many dictators before him, Vladimir Putin fell for the idea of a short and glorious war when he decided to invade Ukraine. Much like the German Kaiser Wilhelm II before World War I, he believed his boys would be back home in a few weeks or even days. That didn't happen. It's now 2.5 years later, and Russia has suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, with no end to the conflict in sight. The Russian military is naturally dishonest with its casualty reports, when they come at all, but recent estimates from Western sources like the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense suggest that Russia has suffered over 300,000 total dead or wounded in the war. Mediazona, one of the few independent voices in the country, investigated the register of inheritance cases in Russia in April. Mediazona claimed that these inheritance cases implied about 75,000 dead soldiers in Ukraine over the first 2 years of the war. The number of dead and wounded are accelerating too. Russia has taken the offensive in recent months. Its preferred strategy is to overwhelm defensive Ukrainian positions through mass manpower and firepower, but this is naturally a costly method of waging war. In July, the UK Ministry of Defense estimated that Russia had taken 70,000 casualties just since May, at a pace of around 1,000 per day. This was the highest casualty rate since the invasion began, even more than when Ukraine defeated the Russian forces in Kharkiv and around Kherson in the summer and fall of 22, and composed a tenth of the total Russian casualties to that point. For now, the Russian public has been kept largely in the dark about the true cost of the war in Ukraine, but with these accelerating losses, this ignorance might be starting to fade. He might not need to worry about re-election anymore, but it would be problematic for Putin if the Russian public started to feel like they were suffering too many losses. Yet Putin is in desperate need of more manpower to cover the accelerating casualties. So if you're a dictator, what do? Putin seems to be answering with an approach that many dictators have taken before him since ancient times, relying on foreign mercenaries. How did he get here? Will the new sources of manpower help him to avoid the worst political consequences prolonged warfare could bring his regime? One of the ways that Putin's regime has managed to cover up the worst costs of the war in Ukraine is by concentrating the losses in outlying regions. The April 2024 Mediazona investigation about Russian casualties found that the bulk of them came from the Krasnodar Krai and Bashkortostan areas. It's no coincidence that these two regions account for such a high percentage of the dead and wounded. They are the third and seventh most populated regions in the Russian Federation, respectively. Krasnodar Krai is close to Crimea, which makes it an ideal place from which to transit troops to the front. However, the bigger tell is that Krasnodar Krai and Bashkortostan sit on the edge of Russia's European heartland, where 75% of the country's population is situated. This political geography puts them close enough to the front and with a high enough population to provide a steady supply of soldiers, but far enough from Russia's elite centers of influence in Moscow and Saint Petersburg to ensure that their losses won't be noticed too much. Russia has taken this principle and applied it throughout its territory. 80% of Russia's male population between the ages of 18 and 49 are considered eligible for military service, but these men have not been mobilized on an equal basis. Logic would dictate that, all things being equal, most of the available manpower would be from the European heartland, and therefore most of the casualties. But in Putin's Russia, things are far from equal. Russia may be a dictatorship, but even dictators have people they need to answer to. Sending a lot of coffins back to Moscow or Saint Petersburg is not something he wants to do. A groundswell of discontent there might be the one source of pressure that he will be forced to take heed of, so he needs to make sure the affluent people there do not suffer too severely. This is why the recruits mobilized for the war effort come heavily from Russia's outlying areas. They are poorer than the national average and disproportionately composed of ethnic or religious minorities. In the autumn of 2022, as Putin began his first wave of partial mobilization in response to Ukraine's battlefield successes, The Economist did an analysis of available data on the Russian forces in Ukraine. The publication found that the regions outside the European heartland provided a disproportionate share of the troops. For example, Krasnoyarsk Krai in Siberia saw about 5.5% of its eligible manpower conscripted in 2022. In contrast, less than 1% of the eligible manpower in Moscow was conscripted in the same time span. The Economist also found that 23 of the 26 regions which supplied most of the Russian manpower in Ukraine were below the national income average. Other sources back the assertion that the war's heaviest costs are being imposed on Russia's poor, minority and outlying populations. The BBC conducted an investigation in September 2022 on 6,000 confirmed Russian deaths. Of these, troops from the Krasnodar Krai, Dagestan in the southern Caucasus, and Buryatia in the Russian Far East suffered the largest share. The 2021 Russian census revealed that Ukrainians made up the smallest ethnic group in Krasnodar Krai, with 2.54% of the population. 5.87% were Armenians, and 83.03% were ethnic Russians. The same census revealed that only 12.5% of Dagestan's population was ethnically Russian. The other portion came from various minority groups. The majority of Buryatia's population, at 52.7%, is composed of ethnic Russians. However, 43.8% are minority Buryats, a Mongolic ethnic group. Each of these regions recorded at least 200 deaths of the 6,000 confirmed. In contrast, only 15 people from the Moscow area, which composes around 10% of Russia's total population, were among the dead. The mobilized troops from the far-flung regions proved vital in stabilizing the Russian forces while they were in retreat and rapidly losing territory. However, they were often improperly trained and prepared for the hardships to come. They lacked body armor. Some reports even suggested they lacked rifles. Worse, many of the regular Russian troops forced them to fight in the front ranks, so they would become casualties instead of the veterans. Vasily Matanov, the founder of the group Asians of Russia, best summed up the situation. These people are less defended. If they were to start rounding up Muscovites, then everyone would hear about it. Foreign leaders even got in on the act, with former president of Mongolia accusing the Kremlin of using its ethnic Mongol population as cannon fodder. So far, Putin has ignored this reality because he can. However, the population in a lot of these areas is low. Not many people live in Siberia. Therefore, there are only so many eligible men to be called to the colors from Russia's outlying regions. With the rate they are becoming casualties in Ukraine, Moscow's ability to continue dumping the costs of the war on its poorest and least well-connected people is in doubt, and shortages of available replacements have already been reported by European sources. The Kremlin also does not want to resume recruitment of prisoners, whose ranks have already been thinned. This gives us a preview about the next phase of the war. Conscription was not the only reason why so many of these vulnerable men joined the Russian military. For the troops from impoverished regions where opportunities are few, military service is the only realistic way to make money. Russia now seems to be keen to export this model abroad, literally. Rather than conscript people from Moscow and Saint Petersburg and create political problems, the Kremlin is looking to foreign countries to find new sources of manpower. Russia's authoritarian form of government allows it to come up with creative ways of finding manpower without resorting to a full mobilization. In response to the new casualties in Ukraine, it's taken to targeting foreign students. African nationals in Russia on work visas have also been targeted. The Kremlin has given both of these groups a new choice. They can sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense and become soldiers, or be deported to their countries of origin. The UK Ministry of Defense reports that Central Asian migrants have also been targeted. There are many of these in the country, and their governments tend to be friendly to Russia due to prior Soviet ties. The British report that Russian law enforcement has concentrated on Central Asian migrants with coercive methods, inventing criminal charges, and then declaring that they must sign military contracts to avoid arrest. But it's not just people working in Russia. Africans in Africa have also been a keen source of interest for Russian recruiters. As early as the spring of 2023, reports of African troops fighting for Russia in Ukraine began to circulate. At first, these troops were reported within the Wagner Group's ranks during the Battle of Bakhmut, where the unit suffered severe losses. Given Wagner's long presence on the African continent, this might not be surprising, but Russia's ties with Africa go back to the Cold War. In that era, the Soviet Union invited African students to study within its borders as a way of increasing its influence in countries that only had recently achieved independence from European empires. The tradition continued after the Soviet Union collapsed, and roughly 35,000 African students are studying in Russia today. Many Africans have favorable opinions about Russia even now, remembering that the Soviet Union supported their efforts in freeing themselves from European colonial rule and Moscow's dogged opposition to the apartheid regime in South Africa. In a March 2022 vote of the United Nations General Assembly, 17 African countries, including South Africa, refused to condemn Russia for its invasion, instead choosing to not participate in the resolution. The use of African troops expanded in 2023. As the year went on, intelligence sources reported on the existence of a so-called Africa Corps in the Russian army, which had a roster of about 5,000 men. Many of these troops had already served in the Wagner Group and were experienced fighters, veterans of the Syrian civil war and conflicts in Libya, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Russia has also simply taken to recruiting mercenaries from abroad directly, again preferring Africa. Not coincidentally, as Russian casualties were accelerating in the spring of 2024, reports began to circulate that the Kremlin was redoubling its efforts to bring these foreign fighters in. Ukrainian intelligence sources report that Russian recruitment drives have ramped up in sub-Saharan Africa. The bulk of the effort seems to be concentrated in 4 countries: Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Uganda. Somalia may also be a target. With its long civil war, it has experienced fighters, and Somalis have been a known presence in Russia's already existing Africa Corps. Russian military recruiters are reportedly offering troops from these and other African countries a $2,200 monthly salary, a $2,000 bonus for signing up, health insurance, and Russian passports for themselves and their families. As generally the average annual incomes in these nations is $2,290 in Congo, $930 in Uganda and Rwanda, $600 in Somalia, and $200 in Burundi. This offer is obviously an attractive one. One Nigerian soldier fighting for Ukraine in 2022 grimly reported that life there, even in a war zone, was more desirable than his impoverished homeland, where the annual income is $2,160. Many African mercenaries fighting on the opposite side of the war probably think the same. The population in sub-Saharan Africa is also growing faster than any other portion of the world. It's a young source of manpower, which is notable considering that the average age of the soldiers on both sides of the war in Ukraine is in the 30s and 40s, far older than wars in the past. This is because Russia and Ukraine's populations are aging rapidly. In Africa, Putin has a source of manpower he may be hoping to call upon in the long term. It's not known how many Africans have taken up the Russian offer, but their presence is growing in Ukraine. Russia does not seem to be limiting its recruitment efforts to Africans or Central Asians. It's reportedly tried to bring in troops from as far afield as Nepal, India, and Cuba. Russia has had long ties to the Cuban regime stretching back to the Cold War. Meanwhile, although India has steadily come closer to the United States thanks to ongoing tensions with China, it maintains a tradition of security ties to Russia. It buys Russian military equipment like the T-90 tank and the S-400 air defense system, even risking American sanctions to do so. New Delhi has also abstained from condemning Russia for the invasion in the UN General Assembly. Its increased purchases of Russian energy have been vital in stabilizing Moscow's financial coffers since the invasion began. Despite this, Indian students have reportedly been targeted by Russia's military recruiters using the same coercive methods. According to India's embassy in Russia, there are about 14,000 Indian nationals in Russia, with roughly 4,500 students enrolled in Russian higher educational institutions. This would not be a significant source of manpower for long, so Putin's regime seems to be getting even more creative in how it's luring additional Indians to fight in its ranks. At least 100 Indian soldiers have been documented fighting in the Russian army in Ukraine, but Putin's regime seems to want to increase this number, no matter how underhanded the methods. In early 2024, Indian authorities uncovered what they called a Russian human trafficking ring. The operation began with Russian recruiters offering young Indian men positions as helpers in the military establishment of Russia. If the Indian men accepted the offer, they would require training. Unfortunately for them, this training was the hardest form of training possible, being sent to the front. The Russian agents reportedly offered these men a monthly salary of around $1,800. Considering the average annual income in India is $2,390, this was an attractive idea. But there was a catch. The Indian men needed to pay the Russian agents about $3,600 to get started. Since this is a sum most Indians cannot afford, the men needed to get the money through a loan. Conveniently, they were then on the hook. Such tactics are common in human trafficking networks. Russian recruiters are reportedly using similar tactics in Nepal, the United Arab Emirates, and Sri Lanka. As of December 2023, at least 100 Nepali men were missing or injured in Russia, with 10 deaths confirmed and 4 confirmed prisoners. The Nepali authorities suspect that there were a lot more. It reached the point that the Nepali government had no choice but to deny permits to any of its citizens who wanted to pursue work in Ukraine or Russia. Why would the Kremlin go to such lengths to avoid mobilizing people from the main European heartland, especially in Moscow and Saint Petersburg, to the point that it would even risk deteriorating the relationship with India, one of its most important post-invasion economic partners? Because all wars are political. Russia has a history of fighting costly wars. In World War I, the cost became so great that the country saw not one but 2 revolutions in a single year, which toppled 2 successive regimes. Putin is aware of this history. Putting more of the burden on the major Russian population centers risks him losing power. Ukrainian sources report that the Russian public is becoming increasingly frustrated about pro-war propaganda, particularly among families of wounded soldiers who see their loved ones being sent back to the front. According to some relatives of these troops, they are returned to the battlefield even when they are sick, have mental fatigue, or have suffered injuries that only recently healed. One mother of a mobilized soldier asked on Russian social media, what kind of stormtroopers would they be if they can't even carry a gun? These people are more likely to be informed of the real situation. Even allowing for some embellishment since the source was from Ukraine, it's easy to see why Putin cannot allow more influential people to see past his propaganda. It's fine for him if families from Siberia or the Caucasus say this. It isn't fine if these people are from Russia's major metropolitan areas. The propaganda also isn't fooling some other people. Russia's military bloggers have repeatedly expressed frustration that despite recent efforts, the size of the invasion force is not enough to conduct the level of offensive operations needed to secure a decisive victory in Ukraine. There are not enough people being mobilized or joining the ranks, despite increases in payments for those who sign military contracts within Russia and the efforts to get people to sign up from abroad. Russia is also losing men too quickly for the force to stabilize. President Zelensky said in a June interview that the Russians were suffering 6 casualties for every dead or wounded Ukrainian. These words should be taken with a grain of salt, since both sides have overestimated the casualties the other has taken in the war. Still, Russia has undoubtedly suffered disproportionately thanks to its poor handling of its military, and this poor handling is becoming increasingly difficult for Putin's regime to cover up, thanks to the depletion of available men from Siberia and the other poorer regions in the country. Do you think this too will fail, and Putin will eventually have no choice but to mobilize more people from Moscow and Saint Petersburg in a desperate, high-risk gamble to win the war? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Russia is running out of everything: planes, ships, soldiers, tanks. Or click this other video instead.